Hello, Petal. How you doing? So it's a bit different today. We've got a recording going on, a live recording, but this will be posted as a normal chapter. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you very, very much, and I hope I can do this in one go, or at least two. Hopefully not three, because that just gets messy. So I'm a little bit nervous. Please excuse that on today. But here we go. Chapter 16 of Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Sausages, J.W. Wells & Co. Book 7. There are 8 books in this series. We've already done the 8th one at Christmas time, but this is Book 7. This is the final chapter, Chapter 16. Let's get it on. As a matter of interest, Don asked mildly, "Why is it the chicken?" The voice didn't answer, and from the depth and quality of the silence, he knew it would never speak again. A cloud must have passed in front of the sun, because the light no longer streamed through the stained-glass window. He thought about trying to find the monk, but decided not to waste his time. "Game over," he said to himself, and, presumably, he won. He got up and walked slowly and wearily to the door. On the threshold he stopped and turned around for one last look, but there was nothing to see. Some old church, its purpose long since obsolete. He supposed someone from English heritage would be along sooner or later to lock up. He walked out into the sunlight, reflecting that this was the weirdest time he'd ever spent in a toilet. Even the grass was different now. It wasn't nearly so smooth and regular. There were dandelions and ducks in it, and here and there it had been nibbled at, so the ends of the blades were square, not pointed. A crow flew slowly past, wallowing in the still air. That cheered him up a bit. OK, so it was still the countryside, but he was morally certain it was now real, not game space. What he wanted most of all, he decided, was a bus stop. If he was honest with himself, he wasn't really all that bothered, but since he had nothing else to think about that wasn't depressing or annoying, he thought about what he'd just been through, rationalising, order out of chaos and stuff like that. It had, he was pretty sure, been a competition, hence all the terms and conditions, a competition to solve the unanswerable and fundamentally stupid question of which came first. The voice had mentioned a date in the 14th century. Around about the time, he was no expert, the abbey was built. Guessing here, but presumably the abbey was somebody's idea of a games console, a gadget designed to choose the winner. Only there couldn't be a winner, because there was no right answer to the question. Not a real answer at any rate. He shunted that train of thought into a siding and rejoined the main line. Obviously, whoever designed the competition had access to some pretty high-level technology. Furthermore, at some point in the intervening centuries, the secrets of that technology had been lost and forgotten, so that when he, a native of the 21st century, happened to stumble across it, he found it completely inexplicable and assumed it must be magic. But it wasn't. No more than electricity or digital information are magic. That had been his first mistake, and it served him right for not having faith in his own scepticism. He was climbing uphill now, though he had no real idea where he was going. He'd come out of the abbey and started to walk, choosing a direction at random. While the game was still running, of course, there was no such thing as random. He could have chosen any vector he liked, but every compass point would have brought him to where the game wanted him to be. Now, though, he was on his own. He stopped and looked around, but it was still all just empty green desert. Buggery, he thought, and walked on. So, the game. He wished he knew what the prize had been. Must have been worth picking up, or why would people bother to enter? Mind, he had no evidence that anybody ever had. At any rate, the competition had remained unsolved and unwon, and since the technology still worked and the batteries had not run down 600 years or so later, here it still was. The pencil sharpener, he decided, must have been some sort of interface that plugged you into the game. The powers must be things you needed to be able to do in order to get here, or to operate the console. At any rate, by sheer bad luck it had come into his possession and forced him to take part, screwing up his life and the lives of those around him. Some people really have no consideration for others. How many other poor bastards had been sucked into competing in the game, he wondered, and what had become of them? He'd never know, so it was pointless to speculate. They'd never have stood a chance, of course. It had been luck and a 21st century mindset that had made it possible for him to succeed where they, presumably, had failed. And he'd only tumbled to the game's secret because he'd spent way too much time playing other, less lethal but equally silly games when he should have been out having a life. Once you figured it out, though, it was simple. You don't win by giving the right answer. You win by winning. Since the question is unanswerable, there is no right answer. Therefore, the only way you can win is by cheating. Narrator's note. So very, very true sometimes in respect of computer games, especially when they're really, really hard. Try Valheim. Trust me, really hard. But cheating, well, it's not really cheating if you put it on the sort of like the casual mode. But, seriously. Anyway, I digress. Back to the book. In the distance, the very, very far distance, he saw a tractor. He altered course a degree or so and headed for it. He knew he couldn't be the only player of the game because someone had played it before and had figured out their secret, just as he had. At some stage in the past, someone had tried to cheat. He didn't know how his anonymous predecessor had gone about it, but for some reason he developed a successful cheat. And then something must have happened, and he never got the chance to confront the great voice, give his answer and collect the prize. Pity in a way, but his sympathy was muted somewhat by the appalling side effects of the cheat, into which he and his sister and the Briggses, and most likely a load of other people, had been unwillingly drawn. It was the cheat that had created the weirdness, the trans-dimensional anomalies and simultaneous lives and all that crap. It was something to do with the cheat, and once he'd recognised it for what it was, he knew that the cheat existed, at which point, since he didn't know the details of how it worked, he'd been left with a straight 50-50 guess. Luckily, he'd guessed right. Simple as that. The tractor was driving up and down, shooting something out into the ground from a trailer. If only he could get there before it finished and went away again. He could hitch a ride back as far as the nearest road, then walk until he reached a village or a town, and then he could go home. The thought made him catch his breath. Home, a mythical place where all your dreams come true. Untold millions of naive adventurers had come to grief searching for it, and many people reckon it doesn't actually exist. Still, it was worth making an effort. Knowing his luck, though, he'd probably end up discovering America. After a very long time, he got close enough to smell what was coming out the back of the trailer. It wasn't terribly nice, but it was definitely real. Appropriate, too, for inside a toilet, except he wasn't anymore. That made him walk a bit faster, even though his feet and the calves of his legs were giving him all manner of aggravation. When he was close enough to be able to read the tractor's number plate, it turned, zoomed through a gateway. Sorry, narrator's note, since when can a tractor zoom anywhere? Now, they've got really big engines, that's true, but I'm sorry, on a main road, there is no tractor on this earth that goes zooming. I think it's spite, personally, but anyway, everybody's got somewhere to be. Zoomed through a gateway and disappeared behind a hedge. Dunn stopped, realising that he was out of breath and pretty much crippled by it. And for the past 5 minutes, he'd been walking through the stuff that had come off the trailer. It was enough to make him wish he was back in the game. No, he bloody wasn't. He trudged through the gateway and found himself on a rough, muddy track between two tall hedges. He could hear the tractor rumbling away somewhere in the distance, too far away for him to catch it now. He looked down at his shoes, which, like him, would never be quite the same again. All because he'd been stupid enough to do his sister a favour. Well, he knew that wasn't true. Quite where the tipping point had been, where he'd lost his footing and slithered into the 600-year-old mess, he couldn't possibly see. Most likely, it had been a gradual process, the final slip being something he wouldn't have noticed at the time. Nobody's fault, though, or nobody living. Just one of those things, like floods or lightning. The lane curved, and in front of him he saw something wonderful. A house. Genuine 20th century brick and breeze block job. So he wasn't in the game anymore. To be precise, a farm with a regulation farmyard cluttered with block and corrugate iron buildings, lots of concrete, some large bits of abandoned machinery, a dilapidated horse box parked in a corner, and chickens. Under other circumstances, far too rural for his taste, he felt like someone who doesn't really like dogs being hauled out of collapsed avalanches by a St. Bernard. "Hello?" he called out, as he took his first step on concrete. "Anybody here?" No answer, but the chickens came running. Naturally, he wasn't scared of a bunch of chickens, far more scared of him than he could ever be of them. That was the whole point of Homo sapiens having dominion over the animal kingdom. The reason they were crowding around his feet was just that they were dead tame and expected him to feed them. That was probably why they were pecking at his shoes, mistaking them for pellets of concentrated sorghum, wheat, bran and essential vitamins, the way you do. "Shoo, chickens," he said in a brisk but friendly voice, whereupon one of them flapped its wings, rose up in the air to kneecap level, and pecked him so hard he yelped. "Get out of it, you—" he started to say, but got no further than that, because another chicken had flown up and sunk its claws into his shirt and was trying to get its head into the inside bucket. Stupid bloody creature, he thought, batting frantically at it and missing. There is nothing to eat in there, just my wallet and my phone. The chicken had his phone clamped in its beak, for crying out loud. It backed away, hummingbird style, for 3 wing flaps before the weight of the phone overcame its already marginal airworthiness, and it sank, still flapping, still holding the phone, to the ground. It landed, running, and was halfway across the yard before it occurred to Don to do anything about it. "Fucking chicken just stole my phone!" But the rest of the flock were right under his feet, almost as though they were deliberately obstructing him from chasing the phone thief. Crazy, or maybe someone had trained them. Could you train chickens? No idea, didn't care. He just wanted his phone back, but that seemed to be an unrealistic aspiration. He kicked out, caught a chicken on its folded wing, and sent it sailing up in the air like a beach ball, which paralysed him with guilt, of course, and the bird landed, immediately found its feet, and rushed back to the scrum, eyes glittering with warlike zeal. "Don't kick the chickens," a voice said sharply behind him. "They're human." He knew that voice. Slowly and carefully, what the hell did he mean, the chickens are human? He turned to see who it was. Then he tried to speak, but his mouth opened and shut goldfish style and no sounds came out. "Mr. Mayor." He breathed out, then addressed himself to the tall, shaven-headed man, not the long, thin bugger in the suit. "Mr. Goggerty," he said. There had been a time when Polly had been seriously, deeply, passionately into ponies. It had lasted about 6 months, ending just after her 15th birthday, the transitional period, the lady at the riding stables had called it, between toys and boys. And now, when she'd looked back on it, she wondered what on earth had possessed her. Big fierce things, with teeth at one end and hooves at the other, falling off, shovelling poo. But at least she could recognise the interior of a horse box when she found herself in one. True, it wasn't like the specimens she had encountered at Mrs. Jeffrey's. It was dark, dirty, and smelt overwhelmingly, not of horse, but of something even worse. Something she noted as she moved her feet, with extremely poor personal hygiene and bowel control. Yeah. Another thing she remembered about horse boxes: when you're inside and the door's shut, you can't get out. Ridiculous, she thought. A fraction of a second ago she'd been in Don's flat, peering into the little rosewood box she'd found in his fridge. She couldn't be scared because something like this couldn't have happened. Fear needs belief. This was just silly, and silliness only made her irritable. She pushed against the door, just in case it was loose. Nope. As well as the main door, which folds down to double as a ramp, there's usually a little side door. She investigated it, found it, saw that there was no handle on the inside. She tried kicking it and hurt her toe. "Hello," she shouted. "Anybody there?" She waited. Polly wasn't very good at just waiting. Restaurants, airports, building societies, government offices, dentist waiting rooms, not happy places for her. Add another category to the list. "Hey!" she yelled. "Let me out!" Nothing. Then she heard a rustling noise, as of wings, somewhere outside. Wings? She thought. Angels? Not that she was in any position to be choosy, but angels struck her as just a smidgy bit excessive. Whatever it was getting louder, and there was also an element of scrabbling. That implied claws, so she could probably dismiss the angel's theory. Her views on the shut door softened. She could see that a steel door tightly closed might just have its advantages. Then light burst in around her as the door swung down, and suddenly the horsebox was full of chickens. Some of them scuttled around her feet, others flapped up at her face or tried to perch on her arms and shoulders, prodding at her with their beaks, almost as though they were frisking her for something. Naturally, she waved her arms, batted at them, and made loud, shooing noises, but they didn't seem inclined to take her seriously. One of them had got its beak around her mobile phone. She grabbed at it, but the chicken ducked under her hand and flapped away, weighted down with its trophy. Maybe, she thought, they're going to beat me up, and they want the phone to film it with. But the chickens withdrew as suddenly as they had come, and she was left alone in the horsebox with a view of a farmyard through the open door. It wasn't a situation that called for deep introspection. She was out of there, like a bullet from a gun. No sign of the chickens, thankfully. She stopped and looked around. Rickety buildings, rusty old machinery, concrete, the rural idyll, bang up to date. At any rate, the weirdness quotient happened to have dropped to an acceptable level. She couldn't have asked for anything more prosaic. Some people, though, would be nice, provided they weren't dangerous lunatics. "Hello," she called out. "Excuse me, is anybody about?" No answer. Sort of creepy. Perhaps all the humans had been killed and eaten by the feral chickens. She could have called for help if she still had her phone. Was that why they'd stolen it? All things considered, and she didn't think she was being too hasty in her judgments here, she rather wished she was somewhere else. In which case, her rational self asserted itself. Why not just leave? Well, quite. There was a gate on the other side of the yard, which could reasonably be assumed to lead somewhere. She headed for it, but before she got there, someone behind her called out her name. Both parts of it. Polly Mayer. She spun round and saw the unmistakable bulk of Mr. Goggerty, the weirdness expert, striding towards her. Behind him, struggling to keep up, was Don. Behind him, looking thoroughly confused, was... She blinked. "Fancy meeting you here." "Mr. Huss," she said. And behind him she noticed the chicken pack closing on him fast. "Look out!" she yelled, but Mr. Goggerty shook his head.
"It's all right," he assured her. "They're not chickens, they're people."
An odd sentiment, she couldn't help thinking. The sort of thing you'd expect from Jamie Oliver. Maybe a little bit extreme even for him. No sign of her phone. Presumably they'd already sold it to buy drugs. "Mr. Huss, be careful," she shouted. "Those chickens are dangerous. They stole my—" But Mr. Goggerty had arrived, taking up a protective stance between her and the flock.
"They aren't chickens," he repeated. "As a matter of fact, I believe they're mostly lawyers, like yourself. There's nothing to be afraid of, trust me."
She stared at him. "Lawyers?"
"I think so," he said. "I haven't had a chance to ask them all."
That was a little bit too much, even in context. "Don," she complained, "he's not making any sense." At which point it occurred to her that she was overwhelmed with joy and relief at seeing her brother again after she'd more or less given up hope. But he was her brother after all, so the cluster of strong emotions surging about inside her could wait. "Do you have any idea what he's talking about?" Don looked sheepish, which was nothing to go by, but he nodded once, briefly, and said,
"Maybe. I'm not sure. Look, wouldn't it be a good idea if we all sat down and talked about this?"
"Yes," said Mr. Huss, in a very loud, clear voice, which made the other three turn. and look at him.
And since I'm paying Stan's wages, and I have an idea you work for me...
Polly Mayer, Polly said quickly, and in a rather small voice, assistant solicitor in the...
You're fired, by the way,
Mr. Horse said kindly.
Nothing personal. I've closed down the company. I imagine there'll be a redundancy check waiting for you when you get home. Anyhow,
Mr. Horse went on,
I think sitting down and talking about it would be a very good idea indeed. What do you lot reckon?
I think we should wait for Mr. and Mrs. Williams,
Mr. Goggerty said firmly.
I don't suppose they'll be very long, and we owe it to them.
Are you Polly's boss then?
Don asked.
Was,
Mr. Horse replied.
Like I just said, I've shut down the business, and so my sister's out of a job just because you take it into your head to...
Don, Polly snapped, her face red as a beetroot. Stop it.
Yes, but... Really, Mr. Horse said, I had no choice. All the houses I sold never really existed. And that makes it all right, does it?
Mr. Goggerty frowned, unsure what to do. He was no stranger to conflict. He bought silver bullets by the caseload and wooden stakes by the pallet load. A market gardener just outside Cambridge kept back 4 acres every year to grow a special variety of garlic just for him. Over the years, he'd cut his way out of the bellies of sea monsters that had swallowed him whole, reduced the Lithuanian manticore to a level 6 endangered species, and collected enough yards of mummy bandage to lag the Dome of St. Paul's. There were some fights, however, that he made a practice of steering clear of, and this had all the signs of being one of them. On the other hand, he was impatient to get on, and he needed these people to help him wrap the job up. He cleared his throat politely, but they took no notice. A complex 3-cornered snarling match had sprung up between them, and he doubted whether anything short of a power hose would get their attention. Probably best, he decided, to back off and let them resolve their issues, and then talk to the survivors. From his deepest, most inside pocket, with its unrippable lining and charm-reinforced Velcro closing strip, narrator's note, woohoo! He took the ring that had once been a pencil sharpener and gave it the full force of his attention. It was rounded rather than flattened in section, so it wasn't a human finger ring. There was a point where the 2 ends had been butted together, but not braced or soldered shut. The wear on one side was quite pronounced. He smiled. He knew exactly what it was. That and his knowledge of dead languages gave him at least 1/3 of the answer, but he still wished he had the box. He sat down on a rusty muck spreader, took another look at the ring, then glanced at his surroundings. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. It wasn't small or hidden. He stood up, walked over to it, and sat down on a low wall. Low, that is, to a tall human. He leaned forward, lowering his line of sight. The cockerel, who'd identified himself as Kevin Briggs, waddled across the yard to join him. Stan didn't have his phone anymore, but he had something just as good. His pocket organiser, by Hauptmann of Wiesbaden, one of the only 7 the great man had made before he disappeared in 1906. He took it out, switched it on, and laid it carefully on the ground, so that the keyboard faced Mr. Briggs. The head dipped, the beak pecked. Well. Mr. Goggerty picked up the organiser and thought for a moment. Then, stabbing at the tiny keys with the edge of his little finger, he wrote,
Nearly there. Just need a few more details.
Mr. Briggs pecked for a long time in reply.
My sister and I just turned up, and her boyfriend, he's a cockerel too, of course, a bantam, wanted to rip his head off, but I can't. Can't you hurry it up a bit? Mary Byron's got another phone. She's trying to call, and that's her on. Oh, and there's a whole lot of cars coming over the hill. Be there soon, though. Thought you ought to... Oh, no, big black ones. Limos.
Mr. Goggerty's right eyebrow twitched. So did mine at that moment.
That's interesting, he typed. It looks like they finished arguing over there. Stay here. I'll be back.
He picked up the organiser and put it away, then walked quickly back to join Mr. Hwoss and the Mears.
Better now? He asked.
Mr. Hwoss nodded.
I explained it was all my fault, he said. It is my fault, isn't it?
No, Mr. Goggerty said. It's somebody's fault, but he's not here. I think I may have an idea who it is, but...
Don here has got something to tell you,
Mr. Huss interrupted.
I think you ought to listen.
In the 6th limousine from the back of the convoy, the CEO of United Petroleum twisted his hands together in his lap. Next to him, the president of Turkmenistan had chewed his pencil almost out of the stub. Opposite, the professor of pure mathematics at Harvard was staring blankly through the window, while the Chinese foreign minister kept looking at his watch. None of them had spoken for a very long time. Understandably enough, there was only so much anybody could say about the weather, the food on the plane, and George Bush, and there was no other safe topic of conversation. "That's just stupid," Polly said. Don sighed.
Fine, he said, if you can think of a better explanation.
Mr. Mayor is quite right,
Mr. Goggerty said, which shut both of them up straight away.
There was a competition. It's quite well documented, though very few details survive. We don't know who organised it, for example, and up till now the rules have been a matter of wild conjecture. But we do know what the prize was, and that it was never claimed.
"Prize?" Don repeated eagerly.
What is it? What did I win?
Mr. Goggerty looked him in the eyes.
You should bear in mind, he said slowly, that the competition was set a very long time ago. Also, I had no idea how you'd go about collecting it.
What is it? Don snarled. Well?
Mr. Goggerty broke eye contact.
£500, he said.
What?
Don looked as though he'd just been kissed by a giant squid.
Is that all? 500? Rotten, bloody...
It was a great deal of money back in the 14th century, Mr. Goggerty said. You could have bought a large estate or built a castle. Unfortunately...
Don made a rather vulgar noise and turned away.
I don't suppose there's a second prize, is there? He said. A golden throne or 50 acres of prime real estate in the City of London.
Mr. Goggerty shook his head.
If you consider the nature of the challenge, he said.
Oh, well,
Don shrugged. Then a bolt of lightning lit up the inside of his head.
What about interest? He said. Compound interest. 700 years.
Impossible, Mr. Goggerty said. There were laws against usury in the 14th century.
Oh,
Don wilted.
So that's it then. 500 quid.
Mr. Goggerty coughed softly.
There's also the matter of my fee, he said, for the consultation. As a matter of fact, it comes to precisely...
Don laughed out loud.
Don't tell me, he said. £500.
No,
Mr. Goggerty said.
£506.14. No hurry, he added pleasantly. Any time within the next 7 days.
Don shook his head.
Fine, he said. Polly, will you write a cheque? Can we get back to...
Of course.
Mr. Goggerty straightened his back.
There was competition. You were quite right about that. And it does seem to follow that somebody tried to cheat.
Which was the whole point, Polly interrupted.
Agreed, but he didn't succeed.
Mr. Goggerty looked thoughtful.
Almost, I would suggest, but not quite, and I believe I know what form his attempt took.
He had their undivided attention, so he paused to shuffle his thoughts.
I believe he used a trans-dimensional hub. That's a fairly straightforward piece of technology, he added, as 3 blank stares turned towards him. It uses multiverse theory. Essentially, it's based on the premise that a universe exists for every possibility. In practice, it can turn things into other things.
He stopped and shook his head.
That's actually not true, he said, but the effect is almost the same. It's to do with the disruption in morphic resonance fields that takes place when time and space are folded along a 6-axis seam.
Turns things into other things, Polly said firmly. Got you. Do please go on. Mr. Goggerty smiled.
The cheater decided to cheat by creating chickens that were not born from eggs. You can't create life out of nothing. That's not possible. So the only way he could do it was to change some other life forms. humans, because they're easy to transform, into chickens. This isn't as easy as it sounds. In order to do it, you have to fold across the dimensions so that humans from reality A are delivered into reality B, in which it's possible. Sort of like changing the signs in algebra.
Never got the hang of that,
Don muttered.
I think I was off sick the day they did it in class, and I never quite caught up.
Mr. Goggerty nodded gravely.
The technology, the transdimensional hub, is clearly the key to the mystery. I believe this is it.
He held out his hand and opened it.
The last time you saw this, it was a pencil sharpener. Mr. Huos, he went on, you're sure you recognise this ring?
Mr. Huos grinned sadly.
Oh, yes, he said. I'd know it anywhere.
He looked up with spaniel eyes.
I don't suppose there's any chance.
No,
Mr. Goggerty said, not unkindly.
You put me on the right lines when you mentioned that it kept changing shape inside its box. A hub would do that if it was kept isolated in a strong containment field. If the box is a containment capsule and there's nothing else in there with it, the hub will change itself because there's nothing else for it to work on. Once I knew it was a hub, the fact that you had it with you when you were found was highly significant.
Was it?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Goggerty frowned a little.
It suggested that the shape you are now wouldn't be the shape you were originally born with. I had no idea what you might be, but I knew you almost certainly weren't human.
You keep saying that,
Mr. Huos said, slightly vexed.
I wish you would stop beating about the bush and...
But Mr. Goggerty raised his hand.
All in good time, he said. You had this thing in your possession for quite some time, he went on, and you made the connection between its habit of changing shape and the extraordinary ability you found you had to bend and shape the world around you. I assumed you labelled it magic and left it at that. You're a practical man, Mr. Huos, not an intellectual. A magic ring, you thought. How useful. And proceeded to use your superhuman powers to make money. In a remarkably ethical way, I may add. You took care to hurt nobody, as far as you were aware, for which you deserve some credit.
Thank you so much, you patronising git,
Mr. Huos growled.
By the way, you're fired too.
Other men in your position would not have been so conscientious,
Mr. Goggerty said gravely.
The fact remains that you were using technology you did not understand, and that's always dangerous. In particular, you never grasped the crucial point that the containment field, the little wooden box you kept the ring in, is in fact the pocket reality in which the cheater's experiment takes place. The two are a set, you see. Neither works properly without the other. Inside the box is where you build all those houses. Your office is in there too, which is why you could have people working for you simultaneously, in time and space layered like phyllo pastry. Things started to go wrong not because you lost the ring and box, but because the ring got out of the box.
He shook his head.
Forgive me, he said. I'm jumping ahead again.
He opened his palm and studied the ring for a moment.
The cheater, he said, set out to turn humans into chickens. Naturally, he had to be discreet. He wouldn't want the competition judges to find out what he was up to, and you can be sure they'd have had eyes everywhere. He chose a perfectly ordinary, nondescript farm, just the sort of place where nobody knows from 1 minute to the next precisely how many chickens are running about the place. He needed some way of installing his technology so it would not be noticed, and proverbially, the best place to hide something is in plain sight. The installation would have to look like part of the everyday life on the farm.
He turned the ring over to expose the worn side.
That was what gave me the clue I needed, he went on. That and the name you were found with.
Mr. Huos raised his eyebrows.
Huos?
Greek for pig,
Mr. Goggerty replied,
and Greek is the mother tongue of my profession, just like Latin and the law. He hid the transdimensional hub in the nose of a pig, either the brood sow or the stud boar, I'd say, because they're what you might call the permanent staff, not likely to be shipped off to be turned into sausages. He'd have taken the precaution of encoding the hub so it wouldn't be activated until it entered the containment field. In other words, the ring wouldn't start working until it was put in the box for the first time. And that, presumably, he added, swinging around and pointing, is the containment field right there.
They looked where he was pointing. What? That? Polly said. It's just a... Mr. Goggerty nodded.
A horsebox, he said, but it's also a transdimensional portal, as you yourself proved just now when you came in through it. Thank you, by the way, for clearing that up for me. It makes perfect sense, of course. Think about it. The experiment is set up to begin as soon as the ring enters the horsebox, which will only happen when the brood sow or the boar comes to the end of its working life and gets shipped up to the abattoir. You can call it a built-in timing device, and the joy of it is the cheetah would be miles away when it happened, with a perfect alibi, nothing to connect him to what would subsequently happen here in the eyes of the competition judges.
He smiled.
As soon as the ring entered the box, it would trigger the experiment. A human being somewhere in the world at large would disappear. One extra chicken would materialise in this farmyard, to be collected by the cheetah at his leisure. He'd then take it to the judges and say, "Here's a chicken I took at random from a farmyard. Examine it and you'll find it's never seen the inside of an eggshell. Therefore, the chicken came first."
Don pulled a face.
That would never work, surely.
"Why not?"
Mr. Goggerty said with a grin.
"The chicken would be totally, absolutely, 100% authentic. There'd be no way anybody, even the judges, could tell it apart from any other chicken. The judges would use their powers of insight to see into its past. They'd find that its personal history began when it suddenly appeared out of nowhere, fully grown. No eggs were harmed in the making of this particular rooster. That would be enough. The cheat has won."
Mr. Goggerty fell silent for a while, not noticing the way all the chickens in the yard were looking straight at him. Then he snapped out of his reverie and went on.
"But it didn't happen like that. Something went wrong."
Nobody spoke for some time. Then Mr. Huas said,
"Are you saying I'm a pig?"
Mr. Goggerty nodded.
"My guess is," he said, "that the pig with the hub in its nose must have got out of its pen and into the horse box way ahead of time, before the rest of the cheat's preparations were in place. I don't know the details, obviously, but I'd hazard a guess that he hadn't yet chosen a human to be turned into a chicken, and so the hub hadn't been targeted on a particular individual. Before the cheats had a chance to perform that particular chore, suddenly the hub vanishes and passes beyond his control. The hub enters the containment field and becomes active. The only thing beside itself inside the field is the pig, so it transforms it. The pig vanishes, and at precisely that moment a previously unrecorded human being materialises thousands of miles away on a mountainside in Georgia, a man with no history but in possession of a brass ring, with steel earrings where the galvanised ear tags used to be, and with the Greek word for pig written on the back of his left hind."
Something odd happened to time, but it had nothing to do with magic. Eventually Mr. Huas broke the silence.
"Oh,"
he said. Mr. Goggerty shrugged.
"Well," he said, "you did ask me to find out where you came from. I can't help it if you don't like it."
"Hang on,"
Mr. Huas said.
"What about the $100,000?
Mr. Goggerty nodded eagerly.
"That puzzled me too," he said, "but I think I can explain. The pig had a value. All the livestock on a farm has a value after all. In your case, it was how much you were worth to the farm. Your weight in sausages, basically. The hub transformed that too. I have no idea how it came up with $100,000, but that's what you must be worth."
He smiled weakly.
"In sausages."
Polly shuffled awkwardly. Part of her was in the process of being purged by wonder, pity, and terror. The rest of her, the part that was used to turning up for work in the mornings, wanted to explode in a Krakatoa of giggles. She was a humane, compassionate person, but she was also an office worker, and this man, or this pig, was her boss. "So, what happened?" she asked.
"Chaos,"
Mr. Goggerty replied succinctly.
Mr. Horse started using the hub. It, meanwhile, naturally obeyed its fundamental programming and started turning people into chickens. I imagine the first victim was a female member of Mr. Horse's legal department, whose brother just happened to be a musician. Presumably, Mr. Horse quite innocently did something which led the hub to think she was the chosen transformee. The hub did its work, but it wasn't immediately deactivated, which was what should have happened. So it carried on transforming people. The logical explanation is that it stored the template of its first victim, female lawyer with a brother who plays music, and every time it encountered someone who fitted it, transformed her. At some stage, by the look of it, the hub broadened the template to include the brothers as well, which is how Mr. Briggs got here.
Kevin Briggs, Don interrupted sharply. The man I...
No, you didn't,
Mr. Gogarty said.
You just happened to be on the spot and thinking harsh thoughts about him when he was taken, but it would have happened anyway.
Thank God for that, Don said. I was so worried. I thought I'd killed him.
Then he frowned and said,
Hold on a minute, though. How come I got caught up in it all?
Mr. Gogarty looked grave.
My assumption is that Ms. Mayer here was to be the hub's next victim. It had, so to speak, already noticed her, and therefore you as well. Before the transformation took place, however, something happened that changed everything. Mr. Horse took his coat to be cleaned. He forgot to take the box out of his pocket. The cleaners found the box in his coat and took it out. They must have opened the box and removed the ring from it. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they put the ring and the box in the pocket of someone else's coat.
Mr. Gogarty shuddered.
Yo's.
His mind suddenly flooded with horrible images of what could have happened, but as if from a long way away, he heard Don saying,
But I never saw the box. It definitely wasn't in my coat when I...
Mr. Gogarty sighed. Why couldn't people ever listen?
The hub transformed it, he said. I have no idea what it turned it into, but whatever it was, it ended up inside your fridge, so I'm guessing you must have put it there. You wouldn't have recognised it as a box, most probably, because the hub would have transformed it.
Don shut his eyes, the way you do when you realise you've forgotten something.
I went food shopping just before I went to the cleaners, he said. When I got home, I just shoved all the stuff in the fridge.
Well, there you have it,
Mr. Gogarty said, with the slightest feather of impatience on the edge of his voice.
Glad we got that sorted out. Do you want to hear the rest of it, or not?
All three of them looked at him, but it was Polly who spoke. There's more? He explained it to them, slowly and patiently. He told them about Mr. and Mrs. Williams, who ran a small-time dry-cleaning business in Clevedon Road. He explained that without the hub inside it, the box couldn't function the way it was supposed to. When the Williamses went through the pockets of Mr. Horse's coat, as they always did, to make sure nothing had been left in them, they inadvertently separated the hub and the box. In that short interval of separation, the box discovered that it was empty and activated its emergency backup procedure, extending the containment field around the building it was in at the time. It must, Mr. Gogarty speculated, have proved too much for the box's programming and overloaded its artificial intelligence, causing it to dislocate the entire shop from its native reality. In practice, sending it whirling off unpiloted in both space and time. It went backwards in time, so that the dislocation effect was backdated, the timeline was violently adjusted, and the Williamses had been living their nomadic life for years and years and years by the time Don Mayer first walked into their shop.
I think, Mr. Gogarty said, that Mr. or Mrs. Williams must have taken the ring out of the box in the downstairs toilet, because that's where the field coalesced to form a temporal wormhole, joining the toilet to the hub's final anticipated destination, the ruined abbey Mr. Mayer here told us about, the place where the competition judges were to be found. Hence, at a set time each day, the toilet became a portal back to the abbey, when everything started going wrong.
He explained about that too. When Mr. Huos no longer controlled the hub, everything he'd done with it started to fall apart, gradually at first, but gathering pace as the consequences impacted on each other. Polly started to realise that someone had been drinking herd coffee. The chickens began remembering they'd been human. Norton St Edgar, or the part of it Mr Huss had built on, separated from the rest of the world and sealed itself off so that the only access in and out of it was through the portal. The same effect drew the Williamses' shop there. From the fact that Don had found it deserted, Mr Goggerty deduced that Mr and Mrs Williams had left it and could not get back in. It was just as well, he said, that Mr Huss had closed down the office and scrupulously unpicked every deal he'd ever made. That had at least restricted the spread of the chaos brought about by the separation of the ring and the box. It probably meant that no more lady solicitors would be turned into barnyard fowls. Probably? Polly repeated, shocked.
Probably, Mr Goggerty said. The fact that you're still human suggests it stopped. You'll remember you were the next in the list. Of course, it may have bypassed you and moved on.
The bricks woman. Polly remembered with a shiver. She vanished while I was talking to her. Mr Huss started.
What, Rachel Briggs, who works for me? Oh,
he added, as he remembered who he was talking to.
You wouldn't know her, of course. She's
been drinking my coffee, Polly said. But I did meet her, as it happens, and she disappeared into thin air. Does that mean... Mr Goggerty nodded in the direction of the flock of chickens presently crowded around Polly's mobile, trying to send a text message to the Pentagon.
She's probably over there, right now, he said.
You know, Mr Huss said wistfully, if a fox were to get into this yard right now, it would save me an absolute fortune in severance pay. But I don't want that to happen, he added firmly. I want it all sorted out right now.
He shifted a little to face Mr Goggerty, square on like a boxer.
Thank you for explaining, he said, and I think it was very clever of you to figure all that out. But what exactly are you planning on doing about it?
Oh,
Mr Goggerty frowned, and a cloud passed over the sun.
That's not going to be quite so straightforward.
The motorcade was lost. The chauffeur of the car containing the chairman of the Bank of England, the Polish Minister of Culture, the CEO of Kawagachia Integrated Circuits, and the Patriarch of Alexandria pulled up and wound down his window.
Excuse me,
he asked the driver of the car they'd just met.
Can you tell me how to get to Norton St Edgar?
Trevor Macpherson scowled back at him.
You trying to be funny, he said.
The chauffeur said no, he wasn't, and that it was a perfectly civil question. Trevor realised that it was, at that.
Sorry, he said. You're in Norton St Edgar right now. You just need to carry on down the lane, left at the crossroads, then on 100 yards, turn right, that'll bring you out by the church. Excuse me, he went on, his heart pounding. But where have you just come from?
Heathrow, said the chauffeur. Why? Trevor held his breath.
And you didn't have any bother getting here? No roads closed, or anything?
Roadworks on the M5, the chauffeur replied. That's about all. Why? Behind, the Dalai Lama's driver was leaning on his horn.
Sorry, Trevor said quickly. I'm holding you all up. Take care now.
He wound up his window, crushed his car into the hedge to get past, and shot away up the lane towards the main road. He didn't get that far, of course. 2 minutes later, he was back outside his house, sobbing into his coat sleeve. The chauffeur shrugged and drove on. His sat-nav seemed to have given up entirely. It kept wobbling. At the end of the road, phase shift into an alternative universe. So he switched it off. Clearly, the man he'd spoken to was either a practical joker or from out of town, because the lane just wound on and on and on with no suggestion of a crossroads or turning. All he needed, he reckoned, was to meet a flock of sheep coming the other way to make this a perfect day. And in the event, it wasn't sheep. It was chickens.
It's not up to me,
Mr Goggerty said. Mr Huss waited for him to clarify, but he didn't. Then the implications of Mr Goggerty's silence began to spread through Mr Huss's mind like spilt coffee seeping into a keyboard.
Oh, he said. Is that...
Mr Goggerty nodded.
The hub, he said, has to be put back in the box. Unfortunately, I've no idea what's going to happen after that, and I'm not prepared to find out by doing it. It's your ring, he said. I think you should be the one to put it back where it belongs.
For a very long time, nobody spoke or moved or breathed. Then, Mr. Horse sort of twisted away like a child trying to avoid an injection.
What'll happen to me if I...
He didn't finish the sentence, and Mr. Goggerty didn't reply.
No,
Mr. Horse said.
I won't do it. And you can't make me. You said yourself it's not my fault.
Fault's got nothing to do with it,
Mr. Goggerty said sadly.
It's entirely up to you, of course. You can take the hub back into the containment field and find out what happens, or we can all stand round here for the rest of our lives, if that's what you really want. To be honest with you, I can't imagine anything that could happen to you in there that'd be worse than hanging around this farmyard until we die of old age or starvation. But perhaps you can. Now, if you'll excuse me for a few minutes, there's a few points I want to clear up with the chicken.
Mr. Horse opened his mouth to say something, but thought better of it and let him go. A moment or so later, Mr. Goggerty was sitting on his heels, typing into his personal organiser, a tall mountain towering over a sea of huddling poultry.
Well,
Mr. Horse said, as Polly tried not to look at him.
I suppose I owe you an apology.
Oh, that's all right, Polly replied, her voice as brittle as icicles. No harm done, I guess. Not by you, at any rate. Or at least, not on purpose. What I mean is, yes, you would appear to have completely buggered up my life, and you did it so you could make a lot of money. But I don't suppose you ever thought the effects would be quite so disastrous for all concerned. Or, if you did, you probably thought the risk wasn't all that great, so you'd probably get away with it in any case, she concluded. It's not all your fault. Not really. Mr. Horse blinked.
Thank you, he said. I feel much better about myself now. What about you?
He went on, looking at Don.
What do you think I should do? Me?
Don took a step back.
Not up to me, is it? No,
Mr. Horse said patiently.
But just pretend it was. What would you do if you were me? Easy, Don said quickly. Nothing on earth would make me get inside that horsebox thing. You couldn't get me in there at gunpoint. And you know why?
Mr. Horse smiled.
I can probably guess, but tell me anyway.
Because,
Don said, I'm weak, gutless, self-centred as a gyroscope and completely lacking in conscience and social responsibility. How about you, Mr. Horse? Are you all those things too?
Mr. Horse thought for a while.
If I've understood this correctly, he said, if I go in there, chances are I'll turn into a pig.
Back into a pig, Polly amended helpfully. And it's all just Mr. Goggerty's theory. He could be completely wrong. I mean, just think about it. It's further fetched than apples from New Zealand. Mr. Horse nodded.
You reckon?
He said. Well, of course, Polly said brightly. Trans-dimensional hubs, containment fields, people being lost in time and turned into chickens. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. I think it's all complete crap, don't you, John? Don nodded very slowly.
It's a bit short on empirical proof, certainly, he said.
Wild speculation, I'd call it, Polly said. Not a shred of evidence to suggest walking into that horsebox would have any bad effects at all. Don't you agree, Don?
You know what?
Mr. Horse said, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere down around his socks.
I think you're right. It's all just a lot of fuss over nothing. Stan Goggerty trying to make out he'd solve some great big enormous mystery so he can whack in a great big enormous bill. So,
he went on, quietly, almost grimly, but without a trace of either anger or despair.
Why don't I go inside that horsebox right now and show him up for the rip-off merchant he really is? Well, what do you think?
Human beings think words are the big deal, the universal tool, the measure of all things. But there are times when words are about as much use as a soda siphon in a firestorm. Good idea, Polly said, in a very small voice, and Don could only nod. Mr. Horse smiled at them, and Polly thought, that's my boss, and he's about to walk calmly into the box and get turned into a pig. Heroes are a bit like supermodels. The papers and glossy magazines are full of them, but we're led to believe they're really a different species, not something you or I could ever become. Not just by deciding to, and particularly not if they're somebody's boss. The terms heroism and senior management exist in very separate universes. By then, Polly said, and Mr. Huas walked into the box. The ramp that was also a door swung up unaided and closed with a bang. They waited, but nothing much happened.
He's gone inside then?
Mr. Goggerty had rejoined them. They didn't reply. It wasn't as though Mr. Goggerty was relying on them for crucial information.
What did you say to him?
Mr. Goggerty asked. Polly shook her head. Don said,
Oh, nothing.
All three of them were too preoccupied to notice that the chickens had left the yard in a flock and gone scurrying up the lane.
Bugger! We must have got through bugger after all,
Miss Byron said, her eyes fixed on the column of long black cars bumping slowly down the farm track, like women in high heels walking in mud.
What did you say to them, bugger?
Asked Charles, the Marla expert, struggling to keep up with her.
But I kept it simple,
Miss Byron replied.
I just said, bugger, Norton, said Edgar. Bugger, Worcestershire's. Bugger, we aren't, bugger, really, bugger, chickens. Take us to your bugger, leader. But it looks like they've come to us instead.
Not the form of words that he'd necessarily have chosen, Charles thought, but apparently it worked just fine. The cars hit a muddy patch and slithered around a little bit. A police outrider fell off his bike and landed in a wide brown puddle, spraying muddy water all over the windows of an enormous stretch Mercedes.
"I got here very fast, bugger," Charles observed. "It shows, bugger, they're taking us seriously,
Miss Byron replied, and Charles, thinking about it, decided she was the sort of person who would interpret this particular subset of facts in that particular way. Mind, she could be right. Miss Byron stopped in the exact centre of the track and spread her wings. She took a deep breath, then called out, in a voice that a human would easily mistake for mere clucking,
"Bugger, bugger, welcome, bugger, thank you for bugger coming, bugger, together I feel we can solve this mystery and bugger working together,
That was as far as she got. The lead car was not stopping. Just in time she burst into flight, her wings flapping wildly, and managed to clear the left front tyre of the oncoming limo by the thickness of a cigarette paper. The other chickens scattered and watched as the motorcade rumbled past. "We should go and see if he's all right," Polly said. Don made a furious, scared noise. Mr. Goggerty didn't seem to have heard. She couldn't blame either of them, Don in particular. It hadn't been long since she'd said more or less the same thing to him, leading him to his rendezvous with the big voice on the ruined abbey. Fair enough, Polly thought. My turn. She took a few steps towards the horse box, realised with a certain degree of annoyance that neither Don nor Mr. Goggerty was going to stop her, and carried on the rest of the way. There was a handle on the door for pulling it down. It came down easily. Inside the box was a pig. She looked at the pig. The pig looked back at her and made that unique barking noise pigs make. She noticed that it had a ring through its nose. "Hello," Polly said. The pig snuffled at her, then advanced, unsure of its footing on the slatted ramp. She wished she had something she could give it, an apple or a swede or whatever it is pigs like to eat. She stood aside to let it pass, and it stepped out onto the concrete, acting a bit dazed, like a released hostage. Polly rejoined the others, and they watched the pig saunter slowly. Pigs' trotters were never designed for walking on concrete, across the yard toward the nearest sty, whose gate was conveniently open. Don tried to remember the quotation about it being a far, far better thing, but Polly said, after all, he was a property developer. He felt she had a point, but that it didn't quite cover it completely.
"Interesting,"
Mr. Goggerty said. "What?"
"It's a sow," he said.
"So?" Polly snapped. "Why shouldn't a sow be a successful property developer?" Mr. Goggerty raised his eyebrows.
"No reason, I guess,"
he said. Then he noticed something out the corner of his eye and turned to look. At the same moment, Polly said, "Don, who are all those people?" They advanced in a column like a school crocodile, except they weren't holding hands. They took no notice of Polly or Don, though the Japanese foreign minister nodded slightly to Mr. Goggerty. They headed straight for the pigsty as though they were radio-controlled.
"Oh,"
Mr. Goggerty said under his breath.
"I see."
The old saddleback sow lifted her head and gazed across the yard at the procession of people coming towards her. She felt a trifle confused because the last thing she could remember was climbing inside the horse box to look for her piglets, all the many litters of piglets who'd disappeared inside and never come out again, and now, by a remarkable coincidence, here they were coming towards her. A piglet, but my how he'd grown, stepped up to the sty gate, stopped and stood there awkwardly. He was dimly aware that he was, or had at some point been, the Chief Executive Officer of Kawagachia Integrated Circuits, but that wasn't the main thing on his mind at the moment.
"Mother,"
he said. The old saddleback sow grunted and smiled at him.
"Hello, dear,"
she said, as the Archbishop of Cologne shuffled up behind him, peered over his shoulder and mumbled,
"Hello, Mum."
At that moment the old sow was happy, happier than if she'd been given a sack full of apples, and so she wasn't interested in eavesdropping on Mr. Goggerty explaining how the transformation field must have acted retrospectively and turned all of Mr. Horse's offspring into humans too. She was just glad to see them all, and know they were safe, and that the implied covenant with humankind, on which she'd always relied, had been proved true in the end. They'd taken her piglets from her, but only for their own good, to give them a better start in life than she could have offered them. So that, she decided, was all right, and silly her for having doubted it for a minute. The next minute, a piglet was telling her, "I woke up on this hillside in the Atlas Mountains with nothing but a suit of clothes and a bundle of cash in my pocket. Luckily, some of the local people found me and looked after me, and when I was old enough, I used the money to pay my way through college. And now I'm the Sikorsky Professor of Solid-State Physics at Kiev University, so it hasn't turned out too bad." So the piglet went on, after a short pause to draw a breath. "How have you been keeping?" The sow tried to remember.
"Oh, can't complain," she replied. "Now mind out of the way, and let me say hello to your brother."
As the procession of the great and good turned into something between a greeting line and a book signing, Polly shook her head and said, "That's so weird. All those people." Mr. Goggerty mumbled something about collateral forces and interdimensional feedback, even contriving to drag in both Newton and Einstein, and Don, who knew enough science to be able to recognise at least one word in 10 of what he was hearing, didn't doubt him for a moment. Interstitiary shear, combined with temporal z-axis shunts, absolutely no question about it. That must have been what happened, and it was nice of Mr. Goggerty to explain it all in such detail. But it wasn't science. Like hell it was science. It wasn't even magic, which, as he now knew, was simply science nobody's got round to writing up for the journals yet. In fact, he hadn't any real idea what it was, though he fancied that if he was really seriously a good mathematician, he might be able to describe it in equations. As far as he was concerned, though, it was quite simply the right thing to have happened. If his life was a 7-note jingle, this would be note number 5, the one that nobody ever hears but which makes all the difference. While he was thinking all of that, Polly was talking to him. He was so used to tuning her out while he was deep in thought that he only caught the very end of it, namely, "Wants a word with you." He frowned.
"Say again."
Polly sighed. "I said," she said, "I think that man over there wants a word with you."
"What man?"
Shuffling into his dressing gown and slippers, George Williams slumped downstairs to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Another day, he thought. Another day, in all probability, just like the last one and the one before that. Not that he was one to complain. He liked things neat and tidy and orderly, and he was only too well aware that he had plenty to be grateful for. A nice little business, with plenty of goodwill and regular customers, in a good location. You don't mess about with a winning formula, after all. Even so, he wandered through into the shop and twitched aside the blinds so he could take a peek at the quiet street outside. Same view as always, same doors opposite, same cars parked, and he knew most of the early bird commuters heading for the bus stop and the station, either by name or by sight. When you trade from the same premises for 15 years, you become part of the landscape. No quarrel with that. It's good for business. Even so, it'll be different, he thought, as he poured the hot water into the mugs. When we retire, we can relax a bit more, take it easy. We could travel. That was something he'd always wanted to do. A bit of the gypsy in him, Eileen always reckoned. But of course, with the shop and everything, that had pretty much been out of the question. It must be fun, he thought, to wake up in the morning and, for those first few seconds of being awake, not to know where you are, to pull back the curtains and see a different view, unfamiliar streets populated with strangers. Best of all, he smiled as he thought about it, not to have to spend the whole day getting the marks and stains out of other people's mucky clothes. Wouldn't that be nice?
Be careful what you wish for,
his mother had always told him.
Be careful, or you might just get it.
Always coming out with stuff like that, she was. Stuff that sounded good, but when you stopped and thought about it, it didn't really mean anything. Take one day at a time was another of her favourites, and there were others he'd never quite been able to make sense of, like things in pockets should stay in pockets, and never open little wooden boxes in the downstairs lav. Of course, she'd got a bit strange near the end, and when that happens, you gradually stop listening. By the time he unlocked the door for the first customers of the day, he put the unsettling thoughts clean out of his mind. Too much to do for one thing, and besides, in the dry cleaning game, there were always surprises. The two men who came in bang on the dot of 9, for example, big blokes, a bit red in the face, between them lugging a great big wicker basket.
Don't suppose you can help us, one of them said, but we're a couple of nights and we've been asleep for a very long time. You wouldn't happen to be able to get rust spots out of chainmail, would you?
There you are,
said Kevin Briggs angrily.
I want a word with you.
Don winced. He had it coming, he supposed. It was all very well Mr. Goggerty saying it had not been his fault, just bad timing and coincidence, but he hadn't really believed a word of it. He was, of course, delighted and overjoyed that the chickens had all become human again about 5 minutes after Mr. Hoss went into the box. No harm done, and all's well that ends well. Weren't, however, cutting it as far as he was concerned. He hadn't killed anybody after all, but he easily could have done.
Look,
he said appeasingly, but Kevin Briggs didn't give him a chance. I've had just about enough of you, he said, as Don wilted under his glare. Making that bloody awful racket at all hours of the day and night. It's making the walls shake. Can't even hear myself practice the bloody guitar. So if I hear as much as squeak out of you from now on, I'm going straight to environmental health, and they'll soon wipe the grin off your... At which point, Don took a good swing and punched him on the nose. The 6th snort, he thought. Perfect. They hitched a lift with a couple of field marshals who dropped them off at Tewkesbury Station. Polly and Don bought tickets to London. Mr. Goggerty phoned for a hire car. They all parted without any fuss. Polly mumbled, "Oh, thanks for everything," and Don wrote out a cheque. He'd decided he couldn't be bothered to collect his prize for guessing which came first. As the train pulled out, he was already humming under his breath 7 perfect notes for Radio Tyneside, while Polly opened the magazine she'd bought at the station bookstall. Mr. Goggerty's car took him to the private airstrip.
"Oh, shit,"
said the pilot.
"You again?" "Yes," Mr. Goggerty said. "You remember how to get there."
It wasn't something the pilot was ever likely to forget. They flew there in grim silence. Mr. Goggerty made a show of checking his messages and doing some routine paperwork, but just for once he couldn't concentrate. He wasn't looking forward to what was going to come next.
Stern.
The old man stepped back to let him in. He stepped out of the blinding glare of the naked sun, and the old man shut the door behind him. Was there a slight edge to the cheery, "how nice to see you" smile, or was it just his imagination?
Always pleased to see you, Stern,
the old man said.
But twice in 1 week.
He frowned.
Is nothing wrong? He says, son.
Mr. Goggerty sat down. He tried not to look at the photo of his mother on the mantelpiece.
"That's what I was about to ask you," he said. "Listen."
He told the whole story. He kept it to the bare minimum without leaving out anything important. He was good at that sort of thing. As he spoke, he tried to read the old man's face, but all he saw there was interest, wonder, concern, all perfectly registered. The old man would have done well in silent movies.
"It was you, wasn't it?" he said.
The old man looked at him for what seemed like a very, very long time. Then he chuckled, a sound that came welling up from deep inside him, like something long contained breaking free.
"What kind of thing's that to say to an old friend, Stan?" he said. "You got a touch of the sun or something?"
"It was you," Mr. Goggerty said. "You tried to cheat the competition."
No way, Stan.
But Mr. Goggarty's face was grim. "You burned down the Carpenter library," he said, "just to stop me finding out."
And then the old man's face crumpled like a paper bag blown up and then burst.
"I'd lose my job, Stan,"
he said.
"If they ever found out. You ain't going to tell on me, are you?"
"I don't know,"
Mr. Goggarty said.
"You can't."
The old man was pleading with him, and he wasn't sure he was proof against that.
"It'd break your mother's heart."
"You shouldn't have burned down the Carpenter, Uncle Theo,"
Mr. Goggarty said.
"That was wrong."
The old man nodded slowly.
"How did you figure it out?"
Mr. Goggarty shrugged.
"You knew all about it," he said. "You told me everything I know when I was a kid. You'll have forgotten."
"I remember,"
the old man said.
"It was on the beach. You were 9 years old."
There seemed to be something wrong with Mr. Goggarty's throat.
"You're the only man in the profession who could have rigged up that hub," he said. "It was a beautiful piece of work."
The old man nodded. No false modesty.
"I was a lot younger then,"
he said.
"Still had good eyesight. Couldn't do it now, I don't suppose."
He sighed.
"The box was the tricky part,"
he said.
"You know how many connections there were in that box? 1,643. All done by hand,"
he said with a spark of pride.
"Just an eyeglass and a soldering iron was all I had to work with. Couldn't afford fancy tools, not then."
He shook his head.
"So,"
he said,
"that boy you told me about, he solved it."
Mr. Goggarty nodded.
"He gave the right answer."
"And the prize?"
There was a pale glow in the old man's eyes.
"He got the prize?"
"No."
Mr. Goggarty looked away.
"He says he can't be bothered to collect it. He's had enough of, well, our stuff. Just wants to forget it ever happened."
"So, the prize is still—"
The old man stopped short. There was a hungry look in his eyes Mr. Goggarty found disturbing.
"Well,"
he said,
"you could say I've got as good a right to it as anybody."
Mr. Goggarty frowned.
"Uncle Theo," he said, "do you know what the prize is?"
"Actual figures? No, can't say as I do. But it's got to be pretty damn good, enough to pay off all my debts and see me right in my old age. And there'll be something left over for your mother when I'm gone. And you as well, Stan. You know I always—"
£500 sterling,
Mr. Goggarty said. The old man's mouth opened, but for a while no sound came out. Then he said,
"What?"
£500,
Mr. Goggarty repeated.
"Shit."
"And before you ask," Mr. Goggarty went on, "there's no compound interest or anything like that. Cash money. I've got the address to write to if you want it."
Slowly the old man stumped forward, his face sliding between his cupped hands. It was more than Mr. Goggarty could bear.
"What we could do,"
he heard himself say,
"is take it back in time and invest it in real estate, Manhattan Island or something like that, and then—"
"Wouldn't work,"
the old man snapped.
"You know that. Didn't you ever listen to anything I told you?"
"Sorry,"
Mr. Goggarty grumbled, and suddenly he wanted to leave.
"Anyway," he said, "I won't tell anybody about the library. I won't say a word about anything, I promise. I better be going now. I've got an appointment."
He didn't bother to finish the lie. He wasn't sure if the old man even registered that he was still there. He stood up, trying to make as little noise as possible.
"I'll see myself out," he said, "and I'll give your love to."
The old man wasn't listening. As Mr. Goggarty stepped out from the cloud into the helicopter, a thought struck him. Something the old man had said. Something left over for his mother, and hers the only picture on the shelf. Just a friend of the family, she'd always told him. Well, he thought. He asked the pilot to take a detour and swoop low over the Malverns. Notting St. Edgar looked very small. One street, a church, a pub that never seemed to be open. The stretch marks had long since gone, but the lanes were clogged with wandering pedestrians, people who'd woken up out of the strangest dream to find themselves standing in a field surrounded by their furniture, and a whole lot of women lawyers, confused, angry, and at a total loss as to who they should sue for what. Mr. Goggerty smiled faintly and told the pilot to fly him back to London. Far below, the old saddleback sow lifted her head, saw the helicopter, figured out what it was more or less from first principles, worked out how she'd go about making one if only she had opposable thumbs, and ate a turnip. So, we've come to the end of it. So it started with the piggy in the sty, and it ended with the piggy in the sty. Oh my goodness. If you haven't listened to it yet, and you don't mind having something that's out of season and whatnot, The 8 Reindeer of the Apocalypse is book 8 in the series, and it is in the same playlist. I've probably just got to tidy things up a little bit. But yes, oh my goodness. I love J.W. Wells & Co. as a series. It's absolutely fantastic, absolutely amazing. And I'm so grateful that we were able to record it with Flat Cat Gaming, Dee Crittle, Rose Brody as well. Who else has been here? Mr. Hairbill, the Bill, the Mr. Hairbill. Yes, and also we've had other people as well come in that I'm so very grateful to all of you. And who else have I had in here? I've had another one. I know I've had another one. The messages have all gone. And Ralph's Trucking, I believe, came in at some point, but it's disappeared. So yes, thank you so much to everybody for being here. I do very much appreciate you. Thank you all for listening. If you can, hit the like button if you enjoyed this recording. If you can hit the notifications bell. If you listen to the recording, you probably wouldn't have heard all the outtakes and all this and the other, but it is actually on my live section of my YouTube. I'm a bit emotional. I can't even. Yes. And yes, I'm very much a polyglot. Yes, that nav must be the 9th. So, yes. I'm going to stop burbling and whiffling on because now I'm getting a bit, got a lump in my throat thinking about it. But thank you all so very much for being here. I do very much appreciate you. And we'll do some community posts and see which series we are going to do next, or if we're going to do the standalones. Rosa suggested Here Comes the Sun, which I think is a perfect suggestion. I've got another book here, which might be a bit more difficult, but it's by Robert Asprin. It's Another Fine Myth. I actually got the paperback, so that might actually make the sounds. I'm not sure, so I've got to do some test runs on that one. I don't want it to end now. But I appreciate you so very much. And we could always do this again if we've got some royalty-free books and stuff that we can listen to, or even classics. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all so very, very much. I love you all so dearly. But yes, we could do some like Grimm stories or Hans Christian Andersen or fairy tales and just put my own spin on it. I've got ideas. There you go, Flat Cap. You see, I've got the first one, and it kind of reminds me of, like Rose had suggested before about Wilt. I don't know if you remember the Wilt series, which the artwork reminded me of that a little bit, and also the artwork of the original Tom Holt books. I'm sorry for going off on all these tangents. I'm just so like, oh my goodness. So, everybody, thank you so very, very much. I'm going to stop recording the actual chapter. As I said, if you can hit the like button, share, subscribe, always so very grateful that you're here. I appreciate you very, very much. And thank you. Thank you for being here. You mean the world to me. Take care, Petal. Look after yourselves.